According to the New York Times, over 2,500 people have been arrested at universities across the United States in anti-Israel, pro-Hamas protests at more than 50 campuses in recent weeks. The most significant protest was at Columbia University. After Columbia's president testified in Congress, protesters occupied the university's administrative building, Hamilton Hall. It was not the first time left-wing activists for a collectivist cause invaded and occupied Columbia's Hamilton Hall. Famously, in 1968, student rebels also took control of the building during campus protests. These protests began when the New Left anti-war organization Students for a Democratic Society pushed for Columbia to cut ties with the defense industry. Observing it all at the time was Ayn Rand, philosopher and author of Atlas Shrugged. Rand was a regular radio commentator in New York in the 1960s, with programs at Columbia University's own WKCR and the independent radio station WBAI. On May 2, 1968, days after Hamilton Hall was cleared by the NYPD on April 30th, Rand took to the airwaves to denounce the occupation. Her remarks are as relevant to today's widespread campus protests as they were in 1968.
The subject of today's discussion is the so-called student rebellion at Columbia University. In an editorial on April 25, 1968, the New York Times, with which I seldom agree, but do agree in this particular instance, has characterized that rebellion as hoodlumism at Columbia.
Rand goes on to quote approvingly from an April 26th statement by a Columbia student group, the Committee for the Defense of Property Rights, which opposed the forceful occupation of the university by the rebels. The committee had urged discipline of previous student occupiers on the grounds that appeasing them would encourage more occupations. They took the escalation of the protest as vindication of their warning and condemned the university's further appeasement of the protesters' demands and failure to stop the occupation of Hamilton Hall. They argued that a president of the university must be willing to protect university property and order on campus, and demanded Columbia President Grayson Kirk's resignation for failing to exercise this responsibility. Rand then reads another statement from the committee from April 30th, which argues that the rebels' seizure of property would turn the university into an enclave of lawlessness and set a dangerous precedent that would destroy the one barrier a civilized nation has against uncontrolled violence and dictatorship. Rand then makes her own comment on the situation at Columbia and its significance for the country as a whole.
When the hoodlums were expelled from the buildings they occupied, a great many formerly neutral students and, what is worse, faculty members rallied to the support of the arrested or dispossessed rebels in protest against the university's use of the police. This seems to indicate that some form or another of compromise will ultimately disgrace Columbia further, and that the thugs and hoodlums who were trying to impose their will by force are going to be let off or whitewashed in some manner. It is obvious, of course, that the only issue involved at Columbia is the attempt to establish force as a proper means of political action. Brute physical force. In 1965, I wrote an article on the rebellion at Berkeley University entitled "The Cashing In, the Student Rebellion." I analyzed the ideological and social roots and meaning of the Berkeley Rebellion, and I predicted that rebellion was only the beginning of a long campaign in which the students would be used as a trial balloon to test out the possibilities of a political coup, a political seizure of power by force. Who was using them? A number of statist collectivist groups who may have differed in their membership but who had one goal in common: the destruction of the last elements of freedom and capitalism in America. In this article of mine in 1965, I stated the following principles. This was the main ideological purpose of the student rebellion's leaders, whoever they were: to condition the country to accept force as the means of settling political controversies. And for its motley leftist leadership, the student rebellion is a trial balloon, a kind of cultural temperature taking. It is a test of how much they can get away with and what sort of opposition they will encounter. And further, if the universities, the supposed citadels of reason, knowledge, scholarship, civilization, can be made to surrender to the rule of brute force, the rest of the country is cooked.
You can learn more about Ayn Rand's analysis of the campus protest phenomenon by reading her essay, The Cashing In, the Student Rebellion, reprinted in her book, Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. The article not only analyzes the motives and ideological roots of the 1965 protesters, but clearly defines the true meaning of free speech, its dependence on property rights, and why mass protests that trespass on property are not protected by free speech rights. She ends the essay with a call to action to students like those who led the Committee for the Defense of Property Rights, but which apply just as much today. The first goal of such a battle is to wrest from a handful of beatniks the title of Spokesman for American Youth, which the press is so anxious to grant them. The first step is to make oneself heard, on the campus and outside. There are many civilized ways to do it: protest meetings, public petitions, speeches, pamphlets, letters to editors. You would be surprised how quickly the ideologists of collectivism retreat when they encounter a confident intellectual adversary. Their case rests on appealing to human confusion, ignorance, dishonesty, cowardice, despair. Take the side they dare not touch. Appeal to human intelligence. Yet reason and morality are the only weapons that determine the course of history. The collectivists dropped them because they had no right to carry them. Pick them up. You have.